Good evening. I'm Louise Mirror, President and CEO of the New York Historical Society, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to History Responds, Pondering the Present, Remembering the Past. I want to take just a moment to express my gratitude to our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and other members, and to all of our supporters who have joined us this evening. It is truly through your support that we are able to do all of our work here at New York Historical, as well as something that just a few short months ago we took entirely for granted. That is opening our doors on Central Park West. I urge you to grab your mask and to come visit us soon. To reserve your timed entry tickets, please go to our website, nyhistory.org. Today, with our reopening to the public, we should be celebrating, and we are. But like every September 11th since 2001, today is also a day of somber commemoration, a day of reflection on the truly horrific and tragic events that befell our city 19 years ago. Over those 19 years, New York Historical has never failed to acknowledge the loss of lives that our city suffered, as well as the resilience, the compassion, and the service of New Yorkers in the aftermath of that awful day. Our speakers this evening will share their thoughts on the way our museum and other museums continue to keep the memory of September 11th alive. Valerie Paley, our moderator, is Senior Vice President and Chief Historian at New York Historical. She also directs our Center for Women's History. Kenneth T. Jackson is Professor of History Emeritus at Columbia University and my predecessor as President and CEO at New York Historical. Ken was in that position on September 11th, 2001, and we all owe him a great debt of gratitude for his leadership at our institution on that day. Thank you all once again for joining us this evening. And now I'll hand the program over to Valerie and Ken. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise, and good evening, everyone. It is truly a pleasure, albeit a solemn one, to be speaking to my dear friend, professor, and former boss, Kenneth T. Jackson. Before we launch into our program, I want to let you know that it will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. We have disabled the chat function, so please do make sure to use Q&A. After the presentation, we will get to as many questions as time allows. So, there have been many standout days throughout the 20th century when something happens that touches everyone profoundly, no matter who you are or where you are. These are the kinds of moments that warrant a personal story of a shared past. Where were you when JFK was shot? What were you doing when the astronaut Neil Armstrong first stepped on the moon? For those of us old enough, how about the end of World War II? Or for those of us from New York City, which blackouts do you remember and what were you doing? Or even now, what did you do your last day before the COVID-19 lockdown? And what were you thinking? Fast forward to today, September 11th. Apart from the fact that today, New York Historical is reopening its doors to the public after being shuttered for 6 months, the date might be just another ordinary fall day, were it not for the fact that on September 2001, Islamic militants hijacked 4 passenger airplanes and carried out terrorist attacks on the United States, killing around 3,000 people. 2 of the planes hit the World Trade Center in New York. Within hours, the Twin Towers collapsed. 2,763 people died, including 343 firefighters, 23 New York City police officers, and 37 Port Authority police officers. Those of us who were alive will always remember 9/11. So where were you, Ken, when the planes hit?
I was still teaching at Columbia University as a part-time professor of history. I was about to begin the class, not class, go to my classes, I think at 10:40, but the plane hit at 8:46, I think. And there was suddenly commotion in the halls, and I turned on the radio, and another person had called me to say that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. From that moment, for the next couple of hours, I was moving between my office and the history office, where there was a big television, and where I saw the second plane hit, and where I heard the announcement, stunning at the time to me, that all air traffic in the United States was to cease immediately. I don't know why that stunned me so much, but it's a vast country, and there are tens of thousands of planes in the air at any one time. And to suddenly say, they all must land now, wherever they are, get to the ground, that was stunning.
And unprecedented, you as a historian. The second plane hit the South Tower around 9:03 a.m. And this is a clock that was collected for the New York Historical Society, donated to the New York Historical Society, that was in the rubble. And it is so poignant and meaningful, picture worth 1,000, maybe 1,000,000 words in this regard. But you were the new, all right, so you were at Columbia, but you also were the new president of the New York Historical Society on 9/11. You just begun. How did that play out for you, just playing these two roles? And, what was it like being, in this position where you had to act as a president of the oldest museum in New York?
Well, first of all, we have a lot of films taken on 9/11, more than 100. And it's interesting, the difference between the first film, when the first plane had hit, and the numbers of people looking up and looking at horror at what's going on. And then about 17 minutes later, the second plane hits. And all of a sudden, everybody realizes this is not an accident. This is a coordinated terrorist attack on the United States. And all of a sudden, people are running. I mean, running, moving to the thing. So that was, clearly this was a gigantic incident and tragedy in New York City history. Immediately, everything closed in New York City. And the next day, Wednesday, the Historical Society was closed. Just a couple of people were there. Friday, we had an all-staff meeting. And I was aware that New York has had, this is not the first tragedy New York had ever had. The Great Fire, in fact, was in 1835. And I remember we had a few little artifacts from the Great Fire. And we had the draft wheel from the 1863 riots, which is the largest civil disturbance in all of American history. And in other words, you didn't have to have a PhD in history to know that this was a very big deal. This was clearly an historic event of great magnitude. So I thought we should, especially ephemera, the kinds of things that disappear, that we should collect that. And so we had an all-staff meeting, which of course I still remember. And I said, there were these 8.5 by 11 sheets, which had, Maria Johnson, 5'8" tall, 132 pounds.
The missing posters.
And
Yes.
they were everywhere, especially in Union Square, but all over the city. That kind of ephemera quickly disappears. And so I said, if you see that, pick it up. I got a little pushback in that meeting because some of our staff members said, look, we're hurting right now. And we don't think we should be collecting stuff about, the fires are still burning. People are still looking for survivors. We don't want to do this. And I don't think I told anybody they had to do it, but I did remind them that firefighters, police officers, ambulance workers, they also had lost friends. And nobody was telling them, okay, you can take some time off to kind of get your emotions back together. No, this is, and I'm not equating historians with the first responders. I don't mean to say that. But that's what historians do this. This is our job, is to collect. And so if you see a piece of paper, you do something like keep it so it can go in our archives. And to the extent that I think I made a mistake at that time, I wish I'd done more, you know, to go down there and just pick up stuff, anything almost, because 99.99% of all that material is gone. And in part because when the Twin Towers fell, they fell straight down. So there's nothing left. I mean, there's not a glass, there's not a computer, there's not a chair, there's not a desk, there's not anything. And so if you find anything like a charred piece of paper or some other things which we'll show you, those will become precious. And so that's what we tried to do. And we have some things which I think are very evocative. I wish we had more, but we did it.
We also saved some of the sort of souvenir type ephemera that was sold in the aftermath, collected things like this I Miss You World Trade Center button. And as a born and bred New Yorker, I put this out with a little bit of snark because nobody really cared much about the World Trade Center until it was gone. In a way, it was just this massive hulk that was underappreciated until it was completely gone. Do you wish to comment about that?
Well, I agree with that sentiment, Valerie. I did not love the World Trade Center. I thought they were so big, they were out of proportion to the rest of the skyline. And also it was in New York City, but not of New York City. You know, New York is a street city. It's a walking city. It's a sidewalk city. But the World Trade Center was kind of lifted up like a giant shopping mall. So it was really not part of the city in the same way that every other street was. So I feel guilty because before it happened, I at times wished it were gone. And now that it is gone, I do miss it, as that button says, because, you're somewhere over in Brooklyn and Red Hook or arriving toward New York City on the New Jersey Turnpike. And the first thing you could see was the World Trade Center. You'd say, well, I'm almost home. Or if you were lost somewhere, which direction is which? But somehow if you saw the World Trade Center, well, okay, now I know roughly where I am. So it performed a kind of function for us in that way also.
Yes, indeed. So wear your historian hat for us right now. You are one of the foremost scholars of New York City history alive today. So, and that's not hyperbole. So tell us, what do you think the big takeaways of 9/11 are for the story of the city?
Well, by any measure, 9/11 is a major event in New York City's history. Not just because 2,763, and of course we don't know exactly that. There were probably a couple of undocumented workers delivering bagels to the 95th floor. And there were even a few people who claimed they were there or their husband was there. But 2,763 is pretty close. 16 million square feet of office space. That's more square feet of office space than most cities have. 62 of the largest buildings in the world disappeared, as well as 7 World Trade Center, which was part of it and was 50 stories tall, and that collapsed. That's like a footnote. It's like a whole huge building in New York City fell, and nobody even knows about it. It's such a footnote to the larger event. But I do think that the whole sense of presentism, which I don't think I get a lot of credit for, I don't think I deserve it. It seems to me that if a museum's function, or part of its function, is to preserve artifacts for study, I think one of the things I learned is how much easier it is to tell a story if you have something, if you have a draft lottery wheel, if you have a fireman's helmet, if you have something like that, to tell this, to remind you of the story. And, for example, there were dozens of pairs of women's high heel shoes that at one point we had, that as women were trying to escape from the World Trade Center fast down those steps in high heels, they began to say, this is crazy. I may have spent a lot of money for these shoes, but I'm throwing them away. And just to look at those shoes reminds you of the hysteria, of the panic, that people would say, I don't want this anymore. I want to get out of here. And those kinds of things tell the story in a way that just my talking or writing an article about it can hardly convey.
Well, essentially the collecting program that New York Historical currently calls History Response began with this decision of yours on 9/11 to collect history as it was happening. Since then, the museum has collected items from recent women's marches to items in our own COVID-19 time. But when you really think about it, New York Historical was founded in 1804 in the aftermath of the era of the American Revolution in an effort to preserve and collect records and documents, lest history become, in the words of our founders, just a bunch of ingenious conjectures and amusing fables. And that's still so true today in our own time. So tell us about, we have some images of some of the stuff we collected. For example, this piece of paper.
Well, one of the ironic things about these enormous buildings, which were essentially turned to dust, is that among the things that survived, and you can see from the moving images at the time, are thousands and millions of pieces of paper floating around in the sky, from filing cabinets and people's desktops, and that they survived, those papers, and they were, who knows how many of these, it blew all the way to Brooklyn, and we caught in the updraft and stuff like this, but remind us of the fragility of life, the fragility of paper, the fragility of everything. And so I think it's important that we have this, not that the piece of paper, but this paper was there. The people who were there with the piece of paper, they're not with us anymore, but somehow the paper could float and it could survive this incredible tragedy.
There's something also very poignant almost about the burned, charred edges of it, and that speaks to the actual fires that were burning within these two buildings or the several buildings downtown. Let's see next image of the fire door. Of a fire helmet that belonged to Ronald Spadafora. And let's talk about the firemen a little. I know that you get very emotional when you speak of what the firefighters did on 9/11 and in the aftermath.
Of those 2,763 people in New York who died that day, 2,400 of them were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They had luck. They were going to die, and mostly they were above the point of impact of those two airliners. But the firefighters, the 343 firefighters who died that day, they were safe. They were safe as you and me. And they intentionally walked into those buildings. They looked up. They could see from the color of the smoke, the height of the fire, that there was not a lot they could do. And even the chief of the department, Peter Gansey, and deputy commissioner said, we're going to lose some people today. They knew this was a serious fire, and there were brothers and other people who looked at each other as they went up. Not one of those 343 firefighters did what I might have done and say, you're not paying me enough to go into this fire. Walk into a fire like this, try to go into the fire, and they all did. In fact, 60 of them, more or less, were not even on duty. But the 9 o'clock roughly was bad news for the fire department, good news for the city, because New York's a little bit of a late go-to-work town compared to the rest of the United States. And there was an election that morning, so many people had gone to the election, and it was Monday Night Football. So people got a little late getting to work that morning. So maybe more people would have died if those two things hadn't happened. For the fire department, it was bad news because 9 o'clock was the shift change. And as the fire alarms rang out in the city, and this was instantaneous because a battalion chief saw the plane go in, immediately called 2 alarms, but knew that 19 fire engines were not going to be enough for this, and it went quickly to 5-alarm fire. That initiative, all those firefighters who died, I think, and by the way, that's more firefighters than ever died in any institute, any conflagration in the history of the world, even the fire bombings of Tokyo or Dresden or other cities, London Blitz. No, nothing like this. So the firefighters do have a special place, and I think in New York memory and in the New York Historical Society memory. We also have a door. I think we have maybe an image of that door from Rescue 2. What New York Fire Department has is 5 rescue companies, one for each of the 5 boroughs, and also about 5 squads. And those are elite firemen whose purpose, whose mission is not to put out kitchen fires or garbage can fires or stuff like this, but to go to big fires, especially when firefighters themselves are at risk. Of those 5 rescue companies and squad companies, all of them were killed on 9/11. Their job was to get to the fire, try to rescue people. Now, that was their job. And Rudy Giuliani's secretary, who was married to the captain of Rescue 1, when she went out of City Hall and saw the World Trade Center's fall, she knew her husband was dead because she knew that was his job. So we have at the Historical Society, because we made a kind of a friendship with Rescue 2, and their fire truck, which was destroyed. This is the main part of the fire truck that still survives. The side of it's totally smashed. By the way, 1,400 vehicles were totally destroyed in the World Trade Center. And that's only because 1,400 vehicles is all you could get close to the World Trade Center. 200 fire trucks were destroyed.
Many of these trucks wound up, and all of this detritus wound up in a large airplane hangar out at the airport, and we got to pick and choose, tag the items that we wanted. There were other museums that were in contention for some of these large oversized materials. Am I just making this up?
Well, no, you're not making it up, Valerie. I did go to a hangar at JFK to see where they'd gathered a lot of the huge girders, steel that was saved. And many places in the United States wanted some of that steel and had it. But among other things, the most powerful thing I think I saw there was a round object about the size of let's say 6 feet table, round table, waist high, battleship gray, jagged. What that was 10 floors of the World Trade Center, all mushed together into something half as big as a person. You realize when you look at that not a flea, not a mosquito, not anything flying around in the World Trade Center that could have survived that. Now, I do know that there were a dozen or so people who somehow, by the grace of God or whatever, were in an air shaft or something, but most of the World Trade Center was compressed into dust. And that's why artifacts such as the New York Historical Society are so precious, because so few of them.
Well, speaking of dust, we do have that artifact as well. We have an image of that, which is fascinating. That's something like this. This is a jar of dust that was covering the streets of downtown. And here we have it in a jar.
Everyone who was in the city, especially south of Chambers, but for a month even north of there, but as the area got smaller, there was a distinctive odor. What is that odor? Well, that's what steel and glass and concrete and human flesh smells like when you turn it into dust. And so we have some of this at New York Historical Society. And I think that generations from now, when people will continue to write about 9/11, they can unscrew this tap and just smell, put their nose in there just for a few minutes and smell an odor like nothing ever. It's not awful. It's just distinctive, because when do you have the occasion for those different things to come together like this? But it's the kind of ephemera that the New York Historical Society has of that tragic event.
There's one piece of ephemera, one object in particular that you yourself picked up in the rubble of the World Trade Center after 9/11. And we have an image of that. Do you care to tell us that story?
Well, I was a member of the vestry of Trinity Church in those years, and St. Paul's Chapel, which is at the corner of Broadway and Fulton Street, but is a chapel of Trinity Church, so it's part of Trinity Church. So I had my membership thing around my neck, and I was able to go into St. Paul's Chapel at different times because of that role. Actually, I later found out that none of my students was in charge of the whole thing, and said he would have allowed me to do anything, but I didn't know that then. But anyway, I went with my wife. We went out into what was at the time the front of the chapel on the Hudson River side, where there's now a cemetery that many millions of New Yorkers have seen. And in that cemetery, the dust, debris from the World Trade Center was up to a couple of feet, almost obscuring some of those markers. And as I walked around in that dusty area, nobody was there. What was out there? Just a lot of dust and old graves. I noticed this weird looking thing that you see in front of you in a tree. And I was a little more limber and a lot younger 19 years ago than I am today. And in a way, like a fool, I climbed into the tree and picked this thing out of a limb and brought it down. I didn't really know what it was, but Barbara said, that's a Venetian blind. It's been twisted incredibly. And what we surmised with others is that that's one of the few things that actually was in the World Trade Center and survived. It was a Venetian blind, not for a whole door, but just half a door, for the window part and then the rest of the door. And somehow in the tragedy and the collapse of the building, that had been blown out, and this cemetery is right across the street, and it somehow lasted there. And it's a horrible looking thing. Looks like an intentional sculpture in some ways.
It does.
So we took that, I rode the subway back, I think to the New York Historical Society. I looked like probably a fool. And Barbara was sitting on the other side. She didn't want to be seen with me. But took this back. And I think the power of this is its simplicity, its mundaneness. In Hiroshima, there's a little child's lunchbox that's virtually destroyed, paint's coming off of it. We have no idea who that child was who took that to school that morning. But in some ways, that lunchbox represents that tragedy as well as anything. We also have an old bicycle that was probably an undocumented immigrant taking bagels to Cantor Fitzgerald. Nobody knows he was alive. I mean, I don't know this, but it's those simple little things that tell sometimes a big story. And anyway, we don't have the computer, we don't have the desk chairs, we don't have the other stuff. This is all we've got. And so I think it gives meaning to that event in a way that will last.
You said about that object later, later on, you wrote, quote, "I felt then, and I do now, and I think you do now, even now, that a little twisted Venetian blind could tell the horror of that day just as well as could a ton of twisted structural steel." And I think that's still what you're conveying right now.
Look how twisted it was.
Yeah.
You couldn't have twisted it that way if you'd intended, but that blast, that heat, that flying through the air more than 1,000 feet and landing in a tree.
Yeah.
So
in our time right now of epidemic and quarantine, what sorts of objects do you think the museum should be collecting? I know we are collecting much as we did right after 9/11. Do you have any ideas about that?
Well, clearly the COVID-19 crisis is of a different sort. But I think that in some ways, the important things about 9/11, because now people think, well, we've never had an experience like this. New York City, is New York City going to survive or not? And I think we need to remember the fires of 1776 and 1778, the yellow fever epidemics of the 1790s, cholera in 1833 and 49 and 66, the great draft riots of 1863, the flu epidemics of 1918, 1919, the blackouts of 1966 and 77 and on. That a great city, just like a person, nobody goes through life without a few scratches, a little bit of sadness, some tears. Neither do cities, neither thing. And what it's like, it's almost like this defines a city. If you're going to be a great city, you're going to survive in a great city, you have to stand up and get over it and play the cards you're dealt. And we clearly have a tough hand to play in 2020. And I think 2020 will be a year like 2001, like 1968 when Martin Luther King was killed, and 1941 with Pearl Harbor, and all these different things. And they're kind of hangers on which we hang history. This is one. And it's not going to be easy. And what we can say from it, maybe letters, maybe images of people, the lives we have lost, which the New York Times runs now, which tells us about seemingly ordinary people who no longer with us. And there, but for the grace of God, go we. And so much of life is mystery, is luck, is chance. And who was eating at the Windows on the World on the morning of 2001, having a perfectly ordinary breakfast, probably an important one. And then there was no chance for them. They looked down, they saw the fire engines coming. They talked to the fire department dispatchers. There was nothing anybody could do for them. That's bad luck. And a lot of people have bad luck now. But New York has gotten bad luck, but my view is it will survive. But I think we should try to save the mundane things from 2020, from the pandemic. Some of the signs saying you can't come in here if you don't have a mask. Well, that's junk. Yes, it's junk now, but in 50 years, it won't be junk. We'll say we put this outside every beauty parlor, every delicatessen, everything else. You've got to wear a mask. But it's kind of things like this. Or what did a mask look like? You know, we hope they won't have these kind of masks, but maybe they will. So it's up to every generation to save the materials of that generation. I suspect we will too.
Well, we're about ready for our question and answers. And I will ask questions, you will answer them. And our first is, were there concerns in those early days about collecting items that had hazardous materials on it? Did people think about that issue when you started collecting?
Well, no, I don't believe the normal thing wasn't that concerned. And of course, in some ways that was, at least that had a beginning and an end. I mean, we thought there may be more terrorist acts, but it was a terrible tragedy, but 24 hours, well, you know, and then trying to recover. So there were some advantages to 9/11 over our own period of time. But I remember wanting to know where those landing gear from the airplanes landed. Because, you know, the planes went in. Can you imagine how strong those buildings were? The largest airliners in the world, fully loaded, went in one side and did not come out the other. That's astonishing. And that those buildings stood long enough for essentially everyone who was below the point of impact to get out. Because we remember, well, you remember in 1945, a bomber hit the World Trade Center and just kind of stuck out and didn't kill many people. This is much bigger than that. And I think 9/11 will always be, at least in American history, a significant event. After all, this great and powerful nation had not been attacked on its own soil in almost 200 years. Can you imagine the audacity of somebody attacking? I was just reading today about in Italy, someone was talking to an American tourist and your country has been bombed, has been attacked. Like, who's going to bomb the United States? Well, they did. And so pride goeth before a fall. I mean, we thought we couldn't be bombed. Well, we found out.
Next question. Are items like the dust collected treated with reverence, considering that they likely contain human remains?
Well, you know, I've held that jar and I smelled that stuff. I think it's important. Everybody grieves in a different way. I mean, clearly New York Historical Society after 9/11, we had 13 exhibitions in a year. Many people who lost a husband, a child, a parent, hasn't even been down there. They can't. Other people have taken a major leadership role but what we did was to say, nobody has to come here. But if you want to come, if this somehow helps you get through this event, New York Historical Society is here for you. And clearly there were thousands of people who wanted to see some artifacts, photographs, thousands of photographs too. People want to experience it. This was what happened in my lifetime. I saw it. I want to experience what did I see. And clearly no event in human history yet has been witnessed by so many people. Clearly all somebody watching television in Istanbul knew more what was going on than a firefighter in Tower 1 who was inside the building and did not know that the South Tower had already collapsed. He was inside. There was noise everywhere. So it was not only somebody in Istanbul and Tokyo and everywhere else who knew what was going on, but you have all the people in skyscrapers in New York City who were pressed up against those windows looking at all the people who live in Lower Manhattan, all the people in Brooklyn, you know, on the Brooklyn Heights Promenade or somewhere else who could see it. And think about New Jersey, all those people, all the commuters on the ferry boats coming in. And that itself is a remarkable story. More than 500,000, about 500,000 people were evacuated by water from Lower Manhattan to Brooklyn, New Jersey, Staten Island in 24 hours. That's more than were evacuated in Dunkirk from France, you know, as the German army has surrounded the British and French army. So I'm not comparing Dunkirk to the World Trade Center, but it's pretty miraculous what happened. There are all these individual stories of what happened and what people did and what they remembered. And one thing I do think we should do more of is to preserve the personal memories of it, because there are millions of them. People took pictures, people did everything. And so it'll be an incredibly well documented event.
In that time, immediately post 9/11, there was, you alluded to a kind of almost religiosity to what the New York Historical Society and what was within it stood for, because it was collecting these objects and ephemera and items. And we did a number of exhibitions and installations which people came to the museum to reflect upon and to feel sort of at peace almost, and to try to come to terms with what had just happened. Tell us a little bit about the exhibitions that were mounted in the immediate aftermath.
Well, we had, one of them was of photographs, because there was I want to say it was down around 4th Street in the Village, where they had collected and they were hanging them from like clotheslines, pictures that people had taken. And also there was I forget the name of the National Photographers Group that just happened to be meeting that morning in New York City. And of course,
Magnum Photographs.
And
yes.
there's a book of that. So there are those kind of things. There was things like the parts of the vehicles that were destroyed. There were lots of movies. You know, I was attacked by a few people, not a lot, but who said it was a little bit ghoulish that I was putting on a show about 9/11 when it was a tragedy and that we shouldn't be making money. Well, I tried to point out that we don't make money on anything at New York Historical. You know, museums, people need to know this. They're money-losing propositions. And the money collected from admissions and this is true of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, of any great museum or small museum, their expenses are enormous. And that wasn't about making money. And it was also costing us a lot of money. But I think you can't serve all the people, but there was clearly a constituency of people, many of whom came back. And there were lines out the door and up the street to try to come in to experience this. And I remember watching so many times, and you had to stand up, by the way, there were chairs in there because these movies that were just running on a constant loop of the airliners crashing into the buildings, and to watch the people's faces, which was almost as interesting as watching the planes, because you're seeing these people looking at horror, sometimes watching people jump from the 100th floor of the World Trade Center. Can you imagine that? And they're seeing that and they're gasping. And then the second plane hits and they're not watching anymore. Boy, now they're clearing out. And then the images of the smoke. I mean, it's just like there's not been anything in American history that can compare with this. You know, the atomic bombs are a little bit different. So I'm not saying we're unique in the world. But for this greatest city in the world and the most powerful nation in the world to be hit like that by 19 terrorists, I mean, it's still an amazing thing that it happened.
I'm sorry, go on.
Well, I feel privileged that I was in a position where I could do something or try to do something at the time. And as I think I said earlier, my regret is not that I asked our staff or asked our institution to remember 9/11 and to collect from it, but that I could have collected more. I know that I could have collected more because I didn't have I should have just gone down there with my thing and said, I'm president of the New York Historical Society. I'm going in. And if they stopped you at one checkpoint, then get through the next one and look for signs that say 79th floor or something, because I'm sure we lost a lot of things that were taken to the dump in Staten Island, the Fresh Kills dump, and were crushed to nothingness. Paper, you know, who knows what we lost. But mercifully, we have some material at New York Historical Society, as at the 9/11 Museum at Ground Zero, as at the Museum of the City of New York, as at the New York State Museum, and at other places. So we're not the only ones, but I think we had an important role to play.
That is actually one of the questions. Do we share any of the artifacts with the 9/11 Museum, which of course didn't exist when we were collecting? In fact, we have shared a lot of the artifacts.
Indeed, we have shared, because that's a huge operation. And it's only focused on 9/11. We've got other things to do. We've got thousands of millions even of objects that we need to show. We're telling the whole story, not just of 9/11. So it's a different mission, but we made this part of our mission too.
We have one last question from our great colleague and friend, David Dunbar, who is the co-editor of the book Empire City with You. And he asks, who was actually in the building and what was the demographic of those people? And what do they tell us, if anything, about New York City and about who we are?
That's a wonderful question, David. First of all, most of the people who died, there were a few children, very few, who were in the airplanes and died. I think the oldest person who died of those 2,763 may have been 72. But the vast majority of the people killed in the World Trade Center were young workers, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. and then it peters out a lot after that. So the demographic, also their spread. You begin to see, for example, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911, or the General Slocum Fire in 1904. If you take the demographics of those people all living together, Lower East Side, close by. The World Trade Center. I mean, Westchester, northern Westchester, New Jersey, Long Island, all over the city. So the draw for the World Trade Center was at least 50 miles in both directions, in all directions, and really more than that. And also you saw that they were black and they were white and they were male and they were female and they were Americans and they were citizens of other countries. And one of the saddest things at the 9/11 memorial, where they have the names etched in stone, a couple of times they put brothers beside each other. And also it'll say Maria Johnson and her unborn child. I've seen more than one unborn child listed there. So really that understates the number of losses that we suffered at the time. But I think the demographic is interesting. I've never seen anybody, somebody probably has, but who really took those 2,763 and dotted them on a map to see where they were, and also plotted out their ages, race. I think it showed that, you know, African Americans were as likely to die as anybody else. Women, I think maybe a third of the victims were female. But very definitely was not the very old and not the very young. Unlike, for example, COVID now, where it's, I think, at least in New York, I want to say 50% are over 70 or something like that. Definitely not World Trade Center.
Well, we have quite unfortunately run out of time. So thank you so very much again, Ken Jackson, for your participation. And thanks to our audience for your support of New York Historical Society. We look forward to seeing you at the museum once again very soon. Thank you and good night.